First of all, thank you for buying the guide. I really appreciate your support, it means a lot. And today we're going to be taking a look at Dogbox, what I think to be the most versatile deck in the format thanks to the amount of techs it can run, the amount of ways you can actually build the deck, and also the amount of ways you can play each matchup. Today we're going to be taking a look at an overview of the deck, an intro to the deck, why it's actually good, and why I think it is one of the best decks in format, a skeleton of the deck to build upon, board state, statistics, and if you're watching on Metafy, we'll be going through matchups. Speaking of the Metafy, if you guys want a deeper look at this deck and be able to understand how to play each matchup, I recommend getting the guide over on my Metafy. It is $10 for the guide, and it'll be updated monthly. I'll also be posting more frequent deck lists on the Discord and on the Metafy, and anyone who purchases the guide can DM me and I'll give you access to the tournament reports and notes. So the overview of the deck is that it has an incredible search engine, Noctowl, being able to search out 2 of any trainer cards when you're evolved while having a Terra Pokemon in play, great versatility in game plans, access to amazing attackers and tech cards, great disruption cards, and strong pressure throughout the game. I've been playing Terra decks for a very long time now, basically since they came out. I really enjoy the box aspect of the deck and the ability to fine-tune the deck depending on what the meta currently is. And I've been playing Dogbox specifically ever since Terra Box kind of fell off, and I'm not gonna lie, I do wish I kind of started off with this deck. This deck is basically able to pull off what Terra Box wanted to do with much more ease and less resources due to the built-in energy engine and higher permanence of the cards thanks to IHP. The higher permanence of the card basically just means that it's more difficult for your opponent to get rid of a Flareon on the board rather than a Terapagos while that's on the board. And the built-in energy engine is obviously the Flareon itself, with Burning Charge being able to take a knockout and also power up one of your benched Pokemon. It is a great way to chain attackers and not have to rely on Crispin the same way Terra Box did. A problem with Terra Box was sometimes that you'd have to use a Crispin plus a Gust in the same turn, and you just didn't have access to that a lot of the times. Whereas this deck, now with Burning Charge, it allows you to chain attacks a lot easier and also abuse cards such as Briar, going in a 1-2-3 prize mapping for quite a few matchups. I do think that this deck has the highest potential out of all of the Terra Box decks thanks to how well the techs slot into this deck and how easy it is to slot different techs into the deck. Due to the amount of tech options, every matchup can be winnable with the correct list. For example, Crustle is basically an auto loss for this deck, but with 1 or 2 techs, this matchup can actually become quite favored in our favor. So here is a skeleton of the deck. This is 50 cards over here, and basically what I'm thinking is most, if not all, Terra Box decks run these 50 cards. And from this is where you can build upon. If you want more energy, you can build upon that. If there's a lot of Gardevoir in your area, then you can add text for Gardevoir. If there's Dragapult, you can add Dragapult text. Otherwise, this is basically the most vanilla 50 cards I could have thought of right now. I feel like the most techie of these cards is probably going to be the Gravity Mountain alongside the Leafeon. The thing is with both of these cards is that they have a lot of uses outside of their intended matchups, such as Leafeon's first and second attack being incredibly strong into more than just one matchup. Sure, it's great against Grimmsnarl, and is kind of the only way you beat Grimmsnarl. It's also good against Charizard and also sometimes Gardevoir, and there are some scenarios where it's pretty good against Dragapult, being able to heal off your bench Pokemon. The same way you might think Gravity Mountain is only good against Gardevoir. Well, you'd be wrong, because it's also pretty good against Grimmsnarl if they have a Frost Ice in play, being able to use Flareon's Carnelian attack for 280, essentially plus 30 from the Gravity Mountain, and then also the Frostlass tick, they will die to a Carnelian, and that's quite useful. Not only is it useful for dealing with Grimmsnarls and Gardevoirs, it's also useful for getting rid of liabilities on your bench. For example, if you fill up your bench to max capacity, being 8 Pokemon, when you play the Gravity Mountain, you cut off 3 of those Pokemon basically because Area 0 is no longer in play, so now you go down to 5, meaning you can get rid of 3 liabilities. For example, you can get rid of Noctowls to reuse the Noctowls with Night Stretcher, or damaged Pokemon that you retreated onto the bench. So they do have a lot more use cases outside of their intended use case, which is quite nice. And that is a nice thing about this deck, is that a lot of these cards have use cases outside of their intended case, such as Clefairy. Clefairy obviously is there for the Dragapult matchup, and it's really good at dealing with Dragapults, but it's also really good at dealing with other decks that bench a lot of Pokemon. For example, in the mirror match. With Area 0 in play, it is very common for Clefairy to hit upwards of 280 damage, because in the mirror match, your opponent is putting a lot of Pokemon onto their field, and so are you. So it has a really solid attack that can deal with a lot of different decks, and is also one of the cards that can hit upwards of 300 damage. If both players have a full bench, that means it's doing 160 damage for each bench, meaning it's doing 320 damage, plus 20 because of the active position. That means you're doing 340 damage. Obviously, this is a rarer scenario, but I am just putting it out there that Clefairy is actually your highest damage output in the game, relatively speaking. I guess you could argue that Leafeon might be higher damage output, but that relies solely on your opponent to attach incredible amounts of energy. And honestly, it's only really Gardevoir that attaches a lot of energy. Pinpointing the perfect 60 for Dogbox is quite difficult due to the deck having so many options. The way this deck is built is very reactive, so lists can vary event to event. For example, if Grimmsnarl falls off the face of the earth and so does Charizard, then Leafeon's probably not going to be as useful, and you'll probably replace that with something like an Umbreon for the Gardevoir matchup. The most contested tech in this deck right now is probably the Sylveon, due to the card either being completely dead or a game-winning card. As of right now, the card is quite well positioned into matchups like Dragapult and can also see some play into Gardevoir. However, your game plan and playing style will depend on if you play the card or not. Today's guide will incorporate Sylveon into some of the matchups, but I've only included in matchups that I think it's really useful, such as Dragapult Charizard and Dragapult itself. However, these matchups are still winnable without the card, so don't think if you're not playing Sylveon you can't win these matchups. Another contested part of the deck is the Pidgeot line. Today's guide will include the Pidgeot line, as I think it is the correct way to play the deck in a format where so many decks play 4-off Iono. Pidgeot is the main reason this deck doesn't just lose to a unfair stamp in the beginning of the game or an Iono to really disrupt you. The problem is with the 4-4 Noctowl is that it is really consistent when you can find the Noctowls. But if you get Iono to one card and you have no way to actually find these Noctowls or any of the other pieces in the deck, due to you having so many one-offs and so many specific techs that you need for matchups, Iono can really hurt you in this deck. So being able to set up Pidgeot can really help you play around the disruption cards, and also just be a really good card to help set up checkmates in being able to set up multiple attackers in the same turn. And also, if your opponent decides to gust the Pidgeot, that means they're going to be leaving an attacker in play, and vice versa. In summary, the deck can be built in many ways, allowing for many game plans, and I'll be looking at what I think is the best approach into these matchups. I will also mention what techs that the matchups require, and what the priority of the cards are. An introduction to the cards of the deck. First off, we have Flareon, probably the main reason that this deck works. It is an incredible attacker with Burning Charge, being able to do 130 damage and also accelerate 2 energy to your benched Pokemon. It is incredibly strong, and usually it is a great way to initiate the prize trade, as not only taking a prize card, you're also accelerating for future turns, and it also helps deal with some of the biggest threats in the format right now, such as Goldengo, being able to one-shot that and also chain an attacker the next turn. So Flareon is a great attacker, and also Carnelian is a great attack to deal with these more awkward HP cards such as Ursaluna and stuff like that. Leafeon is a splashable attacker that can be used in more than just one matchup, and it is our main way to deal with Grimmsnarl. Grimmsnarl being one of the best decks in format right now, and so is Goldengo, and these two cards help those matchups incredibly. This is honestly the main reason the deck is in a really good position, due to the fact that we have such a good matchup into two of the best decks in the format. Leafeon being able to deal 230 damage and also heal 100 from each of your bench Pokemon makes the Grimmsnarl matchup incredibly favored, as their entire game plan is take the slower approach, spread damage everywhere, and try and win the game in these 1 to 2 bigger attacks towards the end of the game. And Leafeon can completely disrupt that by one-shotting Grimmsnarls and healing off all of their little residual damage that they put on your bench. Sylveon is a card that is, you either love it or hate it, and honestly I go from loving it to hate it on a weekly basis. It is a great card, and when it puts in the work, it can really help you a lot. I went to a tournament today and I played against Dragapult, and they had a Genesect in the active position, and they set up double Tracloak, and all I had to do was Angel Light both of those Tracloaks back, and they just had absolutely nothing. That was their entire draw engine there. They weren't able to re-establish any kind of board state, and from there, since Dragapult doesn't play rare candies, they have to go from Dreepy into Dracloak, and then into Dragapult itself. If you disrupt them at this point, and they can't set up more than 2, if they can't set up 3 Dreepies, then the following turn, you can take a knockout, and they'll evolve back into their Dracloaks, and then you can just Angel Light 2 of them away again, and essentially you can just completely shut them out of the game, being able to prevent them from actually playing the game. This is an approach that you'll usually take in the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup, but it is not recommended to take this approach in the straight Dragapult matchup, and we'll get to that later. EVEX is another great card that I think people underappreciate. I don't think you guys really understand how amazing it is to be able to have a Terra Pokemon on the bench that can evolve into any of these amazing attackers and also be protected from cards such as Screamtail. Sure, it might have an ability and can be turned off with something like Klefki, and also might be susceptible to pings from Monkey Dory or Frostlass, but the fact that it can't be killed by Screamtail and also has a higher 200 HP means that we can play around Technical Machine de-evolution quite well, and that is one of the main ways we play into the Grimmsnarl matchup, making sure we evolve our Eevee EX into the Leafeon EX. Another card that hasn't seen a lot of play in Eevee box right now is the Umbreon, and I can definitely see Umbreon seeing a lot more play in the future with the new Megas coming out, and if Mega Gardevoir becomes a strong deck, then I think Umbreon will see a lot of play thanks to its dark typing. And honestly, right now, if your locals is a lot of Gardevoir, I would honestly recommend teching in the Umbreon, because 280 HP, which is a fairly high number of HP right now in this format, and it's not easy for Gardevoir to actually take the knockout on an Umbreon without setting up something like Drifloon or Screamtail, and also having to move 40 damage off of their board with the Screamtail. They need 6 energy for that, and if they're doing that, that means next turn you can bring in your Leafeon, gust up the Gardevoir, and take the knockout because they've attached 6 energy, and 6 times 60 is, well, obviously 360, and that is one-shotting the Gardevoir. So Umbreon can be a really nice attacker, and also it can get you out of some sticky situations with its secondary effect of the attack being Confusion, meaning now against cards like Charizard or Dragapult, they might have to flip for the Confusion. So essentially, if you think about it, Guardy players sometimes just mind bend with their life on the line. Now you can use Umbreon with your life on the line. Moving on to the supports. Noctowl is the reason this deck works. Without Noctowl, this wouldn't be a deck. It is the main engine of the deck and is the only reason that the Terror archetype is an actual thing. It allows for quick setups and immediate responses to threats, and also allows for complete control over our resources and flexible game plans. A lot of decks will say that they want to attack with a specific attacker first and then go into another one and then a tertiary in a very specific way. However, those decks have to rely on naturally drawing into it or using their supporters to draw into these specific things, such as Charizard Dragapult. Charizard Dragapult might want to go Charizard early game and then a secondary Charizard or Chi-Yu and then try and close out the game with Dragapult. The thing is, they have to draw into these cards throughout the game and hope that disruption doesn't hurt them too much. Whereas Noctowl, if we want to go for a Flareon into Leafeon into Terapagos game plan, we can do that very easily with the Noctowl. It allows us to make sure we will have what we need whenever we need it. And with the addition of Pidgeot, it can help us chain together these really big turns where we're trying to pivot the game in our favor, and having Pidgeot set up, once we've already used our Noctowls, then Pidgeot becomes half of a Noctowl every turn, but it doesn't only get you trainer cards, it can get you any card in the deck. But you might be thinking, how do we set up these cards? Well, that is Fan Rotom. Fan Rotom is another amazing card, not only for its ability, which lets us search for colorless Pokemon with 100 HP or less, being able to grab us Noctowl, Hoot Hoot, the Eevees, and the Pidgey/Pidgeotto. It can grab us all of these, right? And this is the main setup engine of the deck, and helps us get into a lot of these games. Usually our first play of the game will be find Fan Rotom and use Fan Call to set up our entire bench with these colorless Pokemon, and from there evolve into Noctowls in the future turns. But not only is it a great setup, it is also a decent attacker. For 1 energy, it can swing for 70 damage, and that is a perfect number to hit in the beginning of the game against decks like Dragapult, against decks like Charizard, and all these evolution decks. 70 damage is perfect, being able to kill these Dreepies, kill these Charmanders, kill these Routes. So don't overlook Fan Rotom, and also sometimes it can honestly be a good idea to just attack with Fan Rotom in the middle of the game if that's what you need. Sometimes you might go down to a single prize board state and you might have nothing really to do that turn because you have to use boss. Then you can just stall out a turn, attack with Fan Rotom, put some damage on the board, and maybe clean it up next turn with the Carnelian. As for the Eevees, we have a 50 HP Eevee. This is the boosted evolution Eevee, which helps us and allows us to get into a evolution on the same turn that it's played. This paired with Glass Trumpet is incredibly strong, as it means if something like our Leafeon in the active position dies, even though it might have had the crystal, we might be thinking we can't set up another Eevee or another Leafeon on that turn? Well, with this Eevee you can. If you have this Eevee on the bench and use Glass Trumpet to it, you can attach 1 energy, and if you use Crispin, you can attach 2 more, and then bring it into the active position, Night Stretcher for that Leafeon, and evolve it again in the exact same turn that the other Leafeon with our crystal went down. So it is an incredibly strong card that can be used to come out of nowhere. A really good matchup for this card would be against Goldengo, as in Goldengo you kind of want to stay in a 1-price board state in the beginning of the game, and sometimes they will target down your 70 HP Eevee, meaning you won't have any Eevees on the board, and this Eevee lets us evolve into Flareon on the turn it is played. So an incredibly strong card, and another reason that this deck can be so aggressive. The 70 HP Eevee is a little bit more of a slower card, and also just a bit more of a generic card. It is a 70 HP basic, which is a good thing because it's 5 Dragapult 60 damage counters on the bench, or 6 damage counters on the bench, sorry. And it's also a little bit less susceptible to TM Devo with its a little bit higher HP, and also it doesn't just die to a Dusclops, whereas this Eevee dies to a Dusclops, this one does not. Usually you won't ever want to put this Eevee into play and just leave it there on the bench if you're playing against Dusclops, as it's a really free price card. The same way if you're playing the 50 HP Pidgey, you probably aren't going to want to put that into play against Dragapult because they're going to have a really easy way to deal with it. Moving on to the others. The others are more so the Terra Pokemon and the EX Pokemon of the deck. Terrapagos is synonymous with the Terra type. It is basically its own type, and whenever you see a Terra deck, you are usually not going to see it without the turtle. It is a great versatile attacker and allows for easy matchups into basic reliant decks such as Raging Bolt or Joltik Box, and it also allows for efficient attack with Unified Beatdown with cards such as Glass Trumpet, and also just paired with Crispin. Clefairy is quite similar to the Terrapagos role, being a splashable attacker in many matchups, but it's also there to help us deal with the Dragapult, because without Clefairy, we don't really have a consistent way to deal with the Dragapult. Whereas now, with Clefairy, we can just one-shot it out of nowhere, and also just other dragon types, for example, the Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt does have a little bit of a higher HP, being 240, and sometimes it might be quite difficult to hit that number, and Clefairy helps us hit that number very easily. Latias is a great Pokemon, being able to help us maneuver around the board and lets us play with cards such as Glass Trumpet very easily, and also helping us with cards such as Boosted Evolution. It's also just great because we have so many basics in the deck and we don't want these to get trapped and have to pay a retreat every turn, because energy is a very scarce resource in this deck and each attachment is incredibly important, so we don't want to be wasting these attachments on these manual retreats. Pheasantipede is actually our only real way to draw cards other than the Iono, so it is a great card when paired with Pidgeot, as now after we get Iono to 1, we can draw +3 if they take a knockout, and on top of that search for any card in our deck. And then is probably my favorite card of the deck right now, and that is the Water Ogerpon. Water Ogerpon is a great card in this format. Everyone is disrespecting Ogerpon, and honestly there's not many decks that play bench damaging attacks. I guess Gardevoir is one of the only ones, but it's not as oppressive as what Ogerpon is, as Ogerpon can just completely win games on its own. Against these evolution decks, such as Dragapult, Charizard, Gardevoir, any of these decks, Water Ogerpon can come out on the second turn and just take out 2 of their baby Pokemon, and next turn do the exact same thing with a Crispin. So this is incredibly oppressive, and means these decks that would like to play a lot slower, such as Dragapult, now have to make sure they can keep him in check, as if they don't, then, well, he's going to run over the game. And this is honestly one of the main reasons that this deck is so good right now, because it is so easy to go for a 2-2-2 prize map with the Water Ogerpon, especially against these evolution decks. Usually what you're going to do is you're going to take out 2 of the baby Pokemon with the Ogerpon, and then in the middle you're going to be taking out either a Latias or a Pheasantipede, or one of the Pokemon itself being like a Gardevoir or a Dragapult, and then after that you're going to be taking out either the Pheasantipede or Dragapult itself. So these are kind of interswappable. But yeah, it is an incredibly strong attacker, and probably the main reason that I think this deck is doing so well right now. So you might be thinking, yeah, this is great, but why should I play Dogbox? Well, there's no other deck in the game that has such a consistent engine of being able to access all of their cards in the deck at all times. Charizard might come close to that, but they only have 1 Pidgeot per turn, where we can use 1 to 2 Noctowls per turn, meaning we have access to 4 trainer cards, and now if we add Pidgeot, we have access to essentially 4 trainer cards and 1 of any card we want, and that is incredibly strong. It is so good to set up our attackers, and also just so good to set up our board state while we try and focus on closing out the end of the game. It is also really nice, as if we have Hoot Hoots at the end of the game, then we can just use Noctowl, evolve that Hoot Hoot, and usually be able to get just bosses orders for game, right? That's how a lot of games come down to is, do I have boss? Yes, I do. That means I win. It is also an incredibly adaptable deck. Dogbox has access to an amount of attackers and tech cards that no other deck really has, and this deck can adapt to any meta and will be good until the day it rotates. The same way Lostbox was just an incredibly strong deck and had access to so many different ways to play it, the same can be said for Dogbox. Obviously, the deck will change with time, and that's just how it will be. We might start cutting cards like Sylveon and Leafeon, or maybe sometimes even Flareon, and just trying to focus on these other kinds of cards in the decks. Whereas Noctowl is the reason that we can do this. We can consistently change and have access to all these different tech cards, all these different attackers, all these random one-offs, and thanks to that, it has a really high skill ceiling, due to you having to have a really good knowledge of your deck and also your opponent's deck, and a really good resource management. So resource management is incredibly important in this deck, as honestly you don't play as many energy as you probably should, but it is really possible to maneuver into these matchups while understanding what resources you have available to you and making sure your prize checking is really good, because there are a lot of one-offs and you have to know that in certain matchups some cards might be of a higher priority than others. So making sure you're able to go through your deck and make sure you have all these resources that you'll need for this game is a very strong and very useful skill to have. Moving on to the decklist variants. The decklist variants are, honestly, this is up to you. What I think is the best way to do it would be more of a hybrid, being the thin Pidgeot line, but for now we're going to start off with the no Pidgeot line. This is probably the most common version of the deck right now, and it allows for multiple tech cards, as Pidgeot isn't taking up any of the space. But the problem is with this deck is that it's very susceptible to getting Iono'd and just bricking out of that. You do have cards such as the Mew EX for additional draw, but that is kind of your only draw you have. There is an argument for 2 Mew EX. I remember Joltik Box or Straight Raging Bolt also used to play 2 Mew EX, as they didn't really have a built-in draw engine. So that can be a thing you can do, as Iono does really hurt you. But it is up to you to play whichever one you want. All three have their own merit, but right now I think in a best of 3 environment, the thin Pidgeot line is probably the best. You might be thinking, okay, but what if I prize one of my Pidgeot lines? Well, if you're playing a thin Pidgeot line, in a best of 3, it's okay. You don't really need to rely that heavily on the Pidgeot, as you do still have access to your 4/4 Noctowl, and the only card that it really hurts prizing completely would be the Pidgey. For example, if you prize the Rare Candy, you can still get to Pidgey through the Pidgeotto. If you prize the Pidgeot, you can still evolve into a Pidgeotto or have a Pidgey on the bench waiting for you to get the Pidgeot off of prize cards. And if you prize the Pidgeotto, you can still get into the Pidgeot through the Rare Candy. So there are many ways to get into the Pidgeot without, even if you prize one of the pieces, so it's not the end of the world. And also you do still have the 4/4 Noctowl, it's just you have a little bit less space for text, as 4 of the spots are taken up by the Pidgeot. There is also a reason to play 3 rather, and just going 1/0/1 with Rare Candy, but no Pidgeotto. And this only takes up 3 spaces. However, obviously if you prize any of the pieces, then all of them are kind of dead. So it is up to you which one you decide to run, but this is a list that I think is doing quite well right now. And another card you could include would be the Hilda, to actually find your own Pidgeottos and that kind of stuff as well. The thick Pidgeot line is, I think, better for a best of 1, as it gives you more out to the Pidgeot and a little bit less text, but that doesn't really matter when you have access to the Pidgeot being able to chain attackers. And obviously in a best of 1, it is a blind matchup and you don't really know what you're going against, and as long as you can perfect your game plan and what you want to do consistently, there's always the chance that your opponent just doesn't have as good as a game as you're able to set up so quickly and just overrun them. This has a great matchup into a lot of the beatdown decks such as Goldengo, such as Raging Bolt, such as Joltik Box, but does sacrifice a little bit of those matchups into to Dragapult and decks like that. However, I'm not saying those matchups are bad, because with cards such as Water Ogerpon, it is still very easy to run over those decks. However, it can be a little bit difficult to get into the Water Ogerpon as quickly if you don't really find your Hoot Hoots or your Knockdowns in the beginning of the game, because you are running a bit of a thinner line of these, and in the beginning of the game, you're always using the Knockdown to get into your Crispin plus Crystal into the Pidgeot, but the thing is you now have 5 or even 6 cards in the deck that might be a bit dead towards the end of the game if you don't actually decide to set up any Pidgey. So which variant you run is up to you. Right now I am running the Thin Pidgeot line. I think this is probably the best version of the deck as is right now, but I think if you're going to be playing the deck to a challenge, I think you should probably play the either the 2-1-2 line or just the 4-4 line, as both of these are consistent in their own ways, one focusing more on the techs and one focusing more on the consistent setup and being able to survive the mid to late game. The early game, it is important to set up obviously your Hoot Hoots and your Pidgey if you're playing the Pidgey, and an Eevee. So the problem is with the deck is that if you don't have a Terra Pokemon in play, you can't have access to your Knockdowns. So saving a slot is quite important for a Terra EX, or having an Eevee for the next turn to evolve into something like a Flareon or a Sylveon or Leafeon, depending on the matchup, is also a great idea. Sometimes it is correct to hold onto your Terra Pokemon against matchups such as Raging Bolt. It is, if you do bench, let's say, a EVEX, sometimes it is very possible for them to hit Prime Catcher into your EVEX, Crispin onto Raging Bolt, and take a knockout, and they go up by 2 prize cards. And if they do that, there's a good chance you're not making a comeback from the game. The problem is with this deck is that it's quite difficult to come back against these other beat down decks if you aren't able to take the first prize card or take the first 2 prize cards. What I mean is that if your opponent takes the first prize card, it's honestly not the end of the world, as you can usually use Counter Catcher to bring up a 2 prizer and then go 2-2-2. Or for example, if you take the first prize card, or for example, if they take the first prize card and then you take a prize card, then what you can do is that you can just stay in the 1 prize board state, maybe take a prize card with Fan Rotom, force them into that second 1 prizer, and then from here, if you just take out a 2 prizer, you'll go down to 3 prize cards while your opponent is on 4 prize cards. They'll go down to 2 prize cards while you're on 3 prize cards, and then you have access to Counter Catcher plus Briar to take those 3 prize cards all in 1 turn, winning the game, even though they took the first knockout and were the first players to take the first 2 prize cards. So it is very possible to win the game with Briar. Thanks to that card, it is very easy to fix your prize map for if you take the first prize card of the game, as you can usually go for that 1, 2, 3. The 1, 2, 3 prize mapping is most prevalent in the Raging Bolt and Joltik box, and also the Goldengo matchups. The mid game it's essential to have multiple attackers established, as it can be quite difficult towards the end of the game to re-establish brand new attackers, as you probably have used 1 to 2 Crispins, you're probably out of your Crystal, and that sort of stuff. So if you're able to start the game with the Burning Charge, trying to attach energy to a secondary or tertiary attacker even, then you can use those other 2 attackers throughout the rest of the game. Making sure you have your prize map set out is incredibly important, as it is not really a deck that you can kind of just go as you please. It's more so you have to plan it out, how you're going to take your 6 prize cards, how the matchup's going to go, and you have to plan ahead. You can't mindlessly use resources, because that might come back to bite you, as you might have needed those resources at the end of the game. A very specific thing you might need would be, for example, you might need a lightning energy for a Carnelian at the end of the game, so you don't want to waste that lightning energy attachment on a Terrapagos for absolutely no reason if you're just going to attack with Unified Beatdown anyway. This does come back to haunt you sometimes, as for example, if you attach an energy to Fan Rotom and let's say it is the Psychic energy and you're playing against Dragapult, and then you bench Latias, well, now this Psychic energy is completely stuck on the Fan Rotom unless you bump your own stadium and get rid of the Fan Rotom entirely. Making sure you have good resource management and control is incredibly important, and a main reason that this deck can sometimes falter. In the late game, usually you want to now set up your Pheasantipede, as you'll probably have multiple liabilities on the board that you don't really mind if they target the Pheasantipede, as you'll probably have checkmate if they do. So making sure you get yourself into a position where the board state is an attacker, a secondary attacker, a support Pokemon, and a second support Pokemon is really nice, because for example, if this is Pidgeot and this is Fez, and this is Flareon, and this is a Terrapagos, well, the thing is, if they kill the Flareon, I have Pidgeot to help establish the Terrapagos. If they kill the Terrapagos, I have Flareon already. If they kill Pidgeot, I have Flareon already. And if they are somehow able to maybe Gus something else up and kill Pidgeot, I have Pheasant to help me draw out of that situation as well. So trying to set up these checkmate scenarios is really important. The main way you do that is with the Pidgeot. For example, in a situation where you have Flareon and an Eevee on the bench, they can target down the Pidgeot, but then you just have Flareon to attack. Whereas if they target down the Flareon, you have Pidgeot to establish your other attacker, right? Or you just have boss for game. So it's very important to set up your Pidgeot in a lot of these matchups, and also it's very important to set up checkmate scenarios. Here are the statistics of the deck. This is kind of taken from multiple deck lists because it's not really easy to pinpoint, like I said, the exact 60. So this is just the This is just the statistics on average. This deck will have a mulligan 11% of the time, 35% of the time you'll be starting with one basic, 64% of the time you'll be starting with 2 or more basics, and then the rest are the other stats. The odds of finding a Fan Rotom with 12 outs, being the 2 Fan Rotoms, 4 Nest Ball, 4 Ultra Ball, and 2 Buddy Puffin, is around 80%, which means 1 in 5 games you won't have Fan Rotom, which can kind of suck. That's why I think this deck is a lot better in best of 3s, because in best of 1s, if you don't find Fan Rotom, it's just very difficult to recover from the game. There's also a 60% chance of you starting energy in your opening hand, and also 74% chance of you starting the Ball Search. Alright, so this is the only matchup I will be going over if you are watching on YouTube. If you want more of these matchup guides and the depth that I go into, please hop over onto the Metafy. I really appreciate the support over there. The guide is $10 and you'll be getting updated matchup guides every month, and also access to my tournament runs and constant updates to the deck list. So Raging Bolt can be a matchup that is quite difficult if not played correctly, and the idea of this matchup is either to take the first prize card, whether it's 1 or 2, initiate a 1-2-3 prize map or a 2-2-2 prize map, or take the first 2 prize cards and initiate the 2-2-2 prize map. If you aren't able to take any prize cards and they take the first 2 prize cards while you're still on 6, this matchup can be very difficult to come back from. Make sure you don't bench a 2-prizer if you're going first. Just a side note, this deck wants to go first all the time. There is no real matchups where you want to go second, and a really nice thing is that there's not many decks in format right now that actually want to go first as well. The only decks right now that come to mind are Goldengo wanting to go first and Raging Bolt with Noctowls wanting to go first, with the exact same reason of trying to set up the Fan Rotom. But if you do bench a 2-prizer against Raging Bolt on your first turn, it is possible for them to take a knockout on it, thanks to the Prime Catcher, and you don't really want to give them access to that, because like I said, if they take the first 2 prize cards while you haven't taken any, it's very difficult to make a comeback. However, if they take a prize card on their first turn going second, usually you'll counter catcher up an Ogerpon and Burning Charge to set up a secondary attacker such as Terapagos or Clefairy, or even a second Flareon, putting yourself down to 4 prize cards. In this case, you'll be up on prize cards and have a really easy time chaining attackers. If they are able to KO with a 1 prize board state, then you'll usually have to counter catcher up a Hoothoot or a Fan Rotom and respond with Water Ogerpon, which will also allow you into a 2-2-2 prize map. But this 2-2-2 prize map feels a lot more like a Terrabox prize map, because usually in this situation you're going to be going Water Ogerpon for 2, and then you're going to be going Terapagos / Clefairy for 2, and then you'll be using Terapagos / Clefairy for 2. The problem is with this, it is you have to constantly hit Crispins, and any little bit of kind of disruption can really hurt this, as it might be difficult to chain attackers. The Trumpet is very important over here, as if you're able to use the Trumpet, you can usually get away with having 1 turn of Boss and not having to Crispin that turn on the turn that you attack with the Terapagos. Usually you'll want to use the Terapagos first if you have access to the Stadium, as at the end of the game you might be out of resources such as Nest Balls, Ultra Balls, Poffins to fill up your bench to 8 to be able to actually hit that really high number of 240 to KO a Raging Bolt. So at the end of the game, usually you want to take the last 2 prize cards with the Clefairy, as it's a lot easier for you to take the knockout onto their Raging Bolt with the Clefairy. If they use Prime Catcher early on, Terapagos can usually solo this matchup with Crown Opal, as these decks have kind of been cutting down on the use of Ursaluna. So honestly, it is very possible for you to just kind of win the game with Crown Opal. If you do go behind in the Raging Bolt matchup, that is kind of your only real approach to the game. If you want to take this approach from the beginning of the game, I recommend not benching a 2-prizer until you're ready to attack with the Crown Opal, and then going Crown Opal. The only way they can really play around this is by going Counter Catcher plus Boss, and you want to make sure that if you go for this play, then you have to have a Night Stretcher in your hand, because you don't want to bench a secondary EX or a Terra Pokemon other than Terapagos to be able to have access to your Noctowls to find the Night Stretcher. So if you do have access to Noctowls while Terapagos is in play, make sure you get your Night Stretcher in preparation for that turn of Boss plus Prime Catcher. Don't worry about the disruption, because if they disrupt with Judge or Iono, that means they can't use the Boss, which means your Terapagos will live that turn, and that means that they're not going to be able to take out the Terapagos plus get rid of that Night Stretcher. And then once they do go for that Prime Catcher plus Boss route, then you can Night Stretcher back the Terapagos and just stay in that one prize board state with having only Terapagos in the active attacking with that. Another reason that this is possible is thanks to the Crystal plus Trumpet. If you set up the first one with Trumpet, you'll use the second one, you'll use the Crystal to set up the second Terapagos, and vice versa. The high priority cards in this matchup are the Terapagos, Clefairy, Countercatcher, Briar, Crispin, and the Water Ogerpon. These Water Ogerpon is more so quite dependent on how the board state looks. If they stick to the one prize board state, this is a very important card. However, if they don't, then honestly it's not the most important out there. But trying to make sure and trying to price check for these guys is quite important, as they will come up very often in this matchup. The Countercatcher plus Briar combination is very strong towards the end of the game, as if they are able to take the first prize card, you can force them into a 2-2-2 prize map by feeding them a secondary one prizer. Alright guys, if you've watched this far, I appreciate it, and like I said, if you guys want the rest of the guide, hop over to the Metafy. I will be posting the video up there shortly, and I will also be posting multiple tournament notes and also updated versions of the deck list. I'll see you guys in the next one.